Welcome everyone, my name is Dan, and in this video I'm going to show you my favorite way of handling development environment. So what is a development environment? It's basically the collection of tools and settings we use to write software. It might start with something as simple as the text editor like Notepad and you're writing an HTML file. Later you might download a more advanced text editor like Visual Studio Code or a full integrated development environment like IntelliJ. You'll continue to add to that with several extensions or plugins to write some specific language, Python, JavaScript, TypeScript, or multiple languages. Time goes on and the problems you are attempting to solve become increasingly complex. You'll add more tools beyond simply writing the source code. You'll add tools to compile, test, analyze, build, and deploy your source code into a deliverable form. All of these customizations and tools are kind of bundled together in the term I'm using as a development environment. So when your environment is simple, reproducing it on a new computer, or when a new coworker or colleague starts working on your project, it's pretty straightforward to have them install Visual Studio Code, for instance. But when there are specific configurations and a lot of technical nuances, it becomes increasingly difficult to reproduce exactly your environment. And this can lead to some very difficult, time-consuming problems to debug. So it's often desirable to be able to quickly reproduce an exact copy or as close to exact copy of our development environment as we want. Sometimes this is done through sharing a development environment, like a development server. Earlier, I had created a video that kind of illustrates this. Another way to do it is with sort of install scripts, which install all the dependencies on a developer's machine. Another way to do this is through containers such as Docker, but Docker can also be pretty complex. So in this video, I am showing you how to use Visual Studio Code's Devcontainers system, which uses Docker, but it's much more user-friendly. In fact, we're not even going to have to type any Docker commands in the command line. So I'm here at the documentation for Visual Studio Code's Devcontainers. I'll go ahead and paste a link to this, but you can just Google search VS Code Devcontainers. And this is gonna have a graphic that's gonna illustrate what's happening. This is just sort of a technical detail, and you can skip this if you want. But basically, it's going to run the front end, the graphical part of VS Code on your local machine. Say you're running it on a Windows machine. This will run on the Windows end. And then once you've installed Docker, it's going to create a Docker container and it's going to run the back end, the part that interacts with the file system in your application and your source code files inside that Docker container. And on Windows, that means it's going to be, those things are going to be on the Windows subsystem for Linux side. But this will also run This will also be the similar setup if you're running it on a Linux system or a macOS system. Well, obviously for this, we're going to need to install Visual Studio Code. This is going to be the easiest way to do this. You can use containers, Docker containers, to do development environments. The easiest way to do this for someone starting out is going to be using Visual Studio Code. Go ahead and follow the instructions in the documentation for your operating system, whether that's Windows, Mac OS, or Linux. If you're on Windows, you'll want to Google search Docker install, and you want to install Docker Desktop for Windows. There's documentation here. It's basically an executable that you install. I'll show what this looks like later. But once you install it and you make sure it's running in the background, you don't actually have to interact with it much through this method. If you're using Linux, well, you can follow the instructions to install it on Linux. Often it may already be installed, or you can install it through various package managers. There's also a version for installing on Mac. You may need to handle it differently, whether you have Apple Silicon M1 chips versus Intel chips. The documentation should guide you. So the first step in our example, I'm going to advise we create a new GitHub repository. I'm going to advise we create it on the website first, and I'll go into a reason to explain it a little later, why I might recommend this. In this case, I'm just going to call it Devcontainers video. I'm going to keep this public for now. I am going to add a README, so there are actual files in here. And I'm going to choose a git ignore template, probably for Node.js for now. Then I'll go ahead and hit create repository. All right, and our repository was created. So let's hold off a moment before we clone it to our local machine. We'll do that in a step that's part of VS Code. Let's open VS Code now. Once you've got VS Code open, we'll need to add a particular set of extensions. Go ahead and open up the extensions interface. Search for the Remote Development Extension Pack from Microsoft. If you click on that, you'll see that this is actually a set of 3 extensions. You've got the Windows Subsystem for Linux extension, the Devcontainers extension, which is the most important one for the moment. And it also has the Remote SSH extension. You might be able to get by with just installing the Devcontainers extension, but these are all pretty useful, so I usually install it via the extension pack. Once that extension is installed, you can hit Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P, I think, on macOS. Then you can start typing in Devcontainers to get a list of commands. You can also access the command palette through the View menu. Now, if you type Devcontainers clone, this will say clone repository in container volume. This is the command we want. You could also use clone repository in a named container volume. That would give the container a specific name. You probably don't need this, but if you wanted to put multiple repositories in a single container, this could be useful. I do want to point out that out of these commands, we don't want open folder in container. So that would be the files are already on your system. Like say in Windows, there's a weird quirk I want to point out that makes this not ideal. Okay, so I opened up this Excalidraw file to try and illustrate this idea that we may not want to have the files first on our system. And this is in particular a problem on Windows where it might cause this to perform slowly. So what happens is if the files are already on Windows, in this case, the Windows file system, and we know that the Docker containers run on the Windows subsystem for Linux. What happens is these files have to communicate back and forth across this system boundary. It's noticeably slower, right? It's going to aggravate you. It might be workable for a little while, but we can avoid it. So let's try not to do it. So the solution then is to, and I'm going to show you this command, is to clone it into the container volume. So directly from GitHub. And that is going to place these files inside the Windows subsystem for Linux file system. Now the communication between the software that is operating on your code and making changes is not crossing the boundary between the Windows file system and then the Windows subsystem for Linux file system. Okay, back in VS Code, it's the Devcontainers clone repository in container volume. Go ahead and click that. It's going to prompt you for the name of your repository. Now this is going to be organization first. So in my case, it's going to be Daniel Hampton and then the name of the repository, Devcontainers video. All right, so when I hit enter here, it may prompt you for, I'm already signed in GitHub. It may prompt you for your credentials. Okay, it opened up another window. This is going to say in the bottom left, opening the remote. And then it's going to say starting dev container. You can click it to show the log. All right, so if I bring this up here, it's going to show a lot of like technical information. This is downloading some basic information, Docker layers for VS Code in order to do its thing. Okay, now you have a prompt to add dev container configuration files. This is basically like what operating system and tools you want to already be in your development container. So for instance, in this first list, you have a very bare bones version of Linux, which is what Alpine is. You have a more common version of Linux, Debian. If you scroll down, you've got Ubuntu. But what we want to do is click on show all definitions. And if we take a quick scroll or tour through this, you can get setups that contain Anaconda for Python 3 development. If you're doing Azure development, you can get containers that are already pre-configured with those tools. So you've got everything from C++ to Go versions with databases already configured, Kubernetes, Node.js development, Node.js with specific databases such as MongoDB and PostgreSQL, PHP, Ruby, Rust, Swift, a whole bunch of options. The one that I'm going to recommend you start with, if you don't have a specific need, is the default Linux Universal Container. So this is the one that they use for GitHub Codespaces. It's going to have a large set of tools already on there, and we can go look at which ones. But this should be sufficient for a lot of development needs. The downside is it might be a larger image to download at first. If we click the open documentation, I can show you where it tells you exactly what's included. All right, it's going to open up the link for the GitHub. You can see in the README, it's going to have some information. Here's the name of the image. And if you click the source link here, you'll get some additional information. So here's a summary. It's going to have languages installed for Python, Node.js, JavaScript, TypeScript, C++, Java, C#, F#, .NET Core, PHP, Go, Ruby, and Conda. Conda is for installing and managing packages with Python. If you want to get more specific information, you can go click the history folder. You can scroll down to the version that you are going, or you think you're going to install. If you haven't specified a version number, it's probably the latest one here. And then if you scroll down here, you'll see that you can set, it's going to come pre-installed with specific versions of Node, in this case 16.19 and 14.21. So there's a lot of information here. It's not important to memorize this unless you are, but if you're curious, you can look at this and see exactly what's included. So back in VS Code, we're going to select Default Linux Universal. Now here, this is new to me. This wasn't here the last time, but you can, it's then going to prompt you to add additional features. So this is sort of like a longer list of a la carte things you wanted to. You could say type Rust, and you could also have Rust installed in addition to what's already included in your container image you previously selected. In this case, for our example, it already included all the things we need. So I'm just going to have 0 selected and hit OK. So depending on your internet connection and your download speed in your computer, this may take a while. So I will come back to this once it's completed and talk a little bit about what happened in the terminal. Okay, that took a while on my machine. It's a lot to download, but once it's done, you should see the files in your file explorer. Okay, you'll see that it's added this Devcontainer folder, this .devcontainer folder, and we'll look at that in a moment. But I'm going to scroll to the top of our long terminal output here. And you'll see at the top, well, it doesn't go all the way to the top, but it basically downloaded a bunch of little layers. Layers are not that important to know about right now, but containers are built in layers such that if you change something on the bottom layer, you don't have to rebuild the image for the previous layers or the top layer, however you want to describe that. Just to explain some things right now, it's downloading this, it was doing this base image for this Alpine thing. This is how Devcontainers uses a container to build your other containers, which I always thought was kind of wild. Continuing to scroll down, you'll see a bunch of run or Docker run commands, Docker events, Docker volumes, Docker inspect. These are all the Docker commands that we don't have to run ourselves because VS Code is handling that for us. Here we have the pull complete. So this is where the two pulling from Devcontainers Universal. This is where it's downloading the individual parts for the one we selected, the default Linux Universal container. Yeah, here we go. It says it downloaded a newer version of the image on my machine. Okay, and the rest is kind of interesting, but nothing that we need to really talk about right now. Let's open up this Devcontainer folder, and you'll see that it only contains the Devcontainer JSON file. You can look at the documentation if you wanted to see what all of this can do. It's actually pretty simple. Right now, we just have a name and we have a reference to the image that we selected. Everything else we can ignore for the moment. What I would like to show you is if we open up a new terminal here, you can click plus, you have a new terminal, you'll get a welcome message. But I want to point out that we are the Codespace user. So if I type, who am I? We are named Codespace. So this is the same technology they are using to run their GitHub Codespaces service. We are in a folder called Workspaces and then the name of our repository. I run a certain command. This is a Linux system. So I'm running this from Windows, but so this is going to be operating as Linux Ubuntu in this particular container. So we can see that we're just on a terminal here. This is 20.04. We can see that we've got Git already installed. And if I open up a terminal on my Windows machine, it's a different version of Git than I have here. So these are isolated from each other, which can be actually very nice to keep your main machine clean of all these things you might install for your developer environments, or keep your developer environments separate. So, a version in one can be kept completely separate from a version of a software in another. We'll also have things like Node.js installed. There's a version of PHP. There's a version of Go, and basically all the things that we briefly looked over in the README. Now that we have this empty developer environment, what can we do? Well, for the first, I would recommend we just commit new files, right? The Devcontainer files. So I can say git commit, I can say git all the files. I can check git status. I can commit, I might say add Devcontainer. Okay, if I hit enter, it goes ahead and adds it. If you're already signed in through GitHub in VS Code, you don't have to, it manages your credentials for you through the Dev container system. That's a pretty convenient feature. And it's already set up with the remote repository, so I can git push and it should update the GitHub. Okay, just to show you how this might work with an actual application, I'm going to install real quick a Next.js application. To do this, you run the command npm, or is it npx? I think you can do npx create next app latest and then do it in the current directory. That's what the period means. We run this, we're going to get an error. We can confirm yes for that. Yeah, sure, I'll use TypeScript, I'll use ESLint. Okay, here's our error. There are already files in our system. So this is a side effect of me having added files to the repository before I initialized this project with the create next app. So what I'm going to do is just a little hack here. I'm going to go ahead and just delete these two things for now, and then I'll bring it back in using git. Okay, I've removed those two files. Now I can run the previous command. Yes to TypeScript, yes to ESLint. Hey, it created it incorrect. I deleted the wrong file. So let's go ahead to the version control. Let's revert the deletion of the git ignore file. I actually need to delete the readme file. Okay, once that's committed, let's redo this. Okay, now it's installing dependencies. And just to reiterate, this is using the node and npm version that is inside the container, and it's completely separate from whether you have it installed on your local machine or not. Okay, there we go. We get a bunch of files, new files on the file explorer over there. If I run npm run dev, which is the command to start the development server, I can click this localhost link. Or actually, what happens is this port is opened up inside the container, and VS Code will automatically forward that to a port that is available on your machine. So once I click here, it's going to open up a browser on my host machine, my Windows machine, so I can see what is going on inside this container. All right, there we go. We see we're at localhost 3001 and it's being forwarded from port 3000. If I go back to my terminal, you can see that, I guess if I refresh this, maybe it'll show that it's updating this in the server here. Well, I guess not. That's okay. You should get hot module reload. So if we go to index tsx in this example, and if I go to main, I can add a style object and say color is red. And if I save this, it'll update on the website automatically. And it should be fairly performant in that if I change this to teal, we get a change. It's actually running a little slower than I normally see it. And it might be because I'm recording. And if I change it to pink, it'll compile. It says it's only taking about a few milliseconds to do it, but I think the video recording is causing a little slowdown. All right, and then development continues as normal. So I'm going to close this here. I do git status. Oh, I actually want to go into the version control and undo the deletion of the dev container file there. Okay, it's okay if the README is adjusted. There wasn't really anything in it before, and this is the boilerplate README from the next app. All right, so I'm just going to commit everything with init next app. So that's going to be everything's good. We're going to push it to the remote. Great. So development would normally continue as it would if you were running this not with dev containers. I wanted to show that if you go to the command palette and there's a command if you want to customize your container, right? So you can go here for dev containers and scroll down to, let's see, what was it? Okay, it's configure container features. Configure container features. There we go. If we click that, we're back to this. So if I wanted to, I could add Rust. I could add Ansible, or probably a bunch of other options that are already in this list. Okay, so this would be, if what you want is already on this list, it would probably be very easy to just click this and hit OK. What it will probably do is modify, oops, let me exit out of this. It'll probably modify this dev container JSON file, uncomment this, and it'll probably add it to the features here. There's a document, there's documentation on how that works here. You can check it out. I'll go ahead and mention that this post create command, you might want to use this when you need to recreate this environment in another machine. When you first create this container, you can have npm install here if you want to automatically run a command like npm install. Otherwise, you just have to remember to do that yourself, which is not a particular big deal. When you try to run your app, it will tell you you don't have your dependencies installed. Okay, what I do want to point out is how powerful this customization is with Docker files. So basically, this image is just a Docker image. If what you want to add is not part of the feature set through the UI I just showed, you can add anything you want as you would in a plain Docker file. So if we go to this link, we can see more information from their documentation. And what we're going to do is modify our Devcontainer JSON file. So instead of this line, right, we are going to take this line, put it in a new Docker file, and then we can run whatever custom commands we want, which I'll show in a second. And then in the Devcontainer JSON file, we're going to replace this image line with this build and then referencing this Docker file. So let me go ahead and demonstrate that. All right, let's go ahead and rename this. We'll call it custom. What we want to do here, I believe we say build and then Docker file. Remove this line here. Make sure to add my missing semicolon here, or colon should be. Okay, let's go over here and add the new file. It's just called Docker file. When we open this up, okay, I had to go back and recopy something here. All right, so now the from keyword and then this string we copied from what was already in the previous file. So this is actually Docker file syntax, which is a whole thing unto itself, but just to demonstrate, let's say we needed some other dependencies that might not be in that list. Let's say we needed ffmpeg for doing something with video files for our application. Do a command like apt-get update, and then we need to run an extra command. So we say apt-get install ffmpeg. Okay, and then just to show it's not all apt-get Linux commands, you could also npm install globally a command line tool such as Firebase CLI, which is the Firebase tools package. All right, so if we save that, you see that we have this new Docker file. We can then see the modifications we made to the previous one. We can check the status here. All right, these are the files that were changed. When we open the command palette again, we can start typing something like rebuild. And then here's the rebuild container. So we're going to do that. It's going to rebuild the container. It won't need to download all the previous stuff. It's already got the information for the original image. We've only added this new layer, like that starts at line 3. So this kind of refers back to what I was mentioning about layers before. All right, let's rebuild and give it a shot. Okay, to see the log, you'll need to click the starting Devcontainer show log button here. You'll see several things are already cached. Okay, and if you're looking with me, you'll see stuff that's familiar, right? The first layer was already done, and now the second layer, this is our command here. So it's going to run the command, and that's what's showing up in gray, all the output you'd normally get from the terminal. Oh, it looks like I had an error. It's going to prompt me if I want to do something, and I didn't give it the automatic approval. So this will demonstrate like how we can edit our file. We can do edit Devcontainer JSON in a recovery container. Okay, and it's going to open up the files along with this log message, and then you'll see that, okay, it stopped right here. It failed to solve something, right? Basically, we couldn't enter yes. So now if I close this, I can open Devcontainer, I can go to Docker file, I can then say, I think it's just -y here. Okay, I make my change, and then what I can do is once again hit rebuild container. All right, and once it's done, we are back up and running. We see that our files have the modifications we made. We can check that we have the software installed. So which ffmpeg, yep, that's in here. We could check which Firebase, that's what that is. So you can also do Firebase version, I think. Yeah, there we go. So both of those tools are now installed, and they are part of the development environment, so they will transfer. If you were to simply install something without putting it in the Docker file or in the Devcontainer config, it would be specific to your version of your instance of the container. It would not transfer when you try to install it on another machine. Great. All right. I pushed that, or I committed that and pushed it to, oops, I need to actually add the other file here. Okay. Got that taken care of. So that's basically it. It would operate as you normally would a development environment. So at this point, you might be asking, Dan, where are the files on my hard drive that this thing downloaded from GitHub, right? Where are these React and package.json files if they're not on the Windows side of the file system? Well, that's a good question. And I thought about leaving it as an exercise to the viewer, but then I felt immediately guilty. So what you can do is come down here to the Remote Explorer part, okay? And if you click that, you will see a list of various containers that you might, in my case, I have already several that I've used. You do want to make sure that this top box is set to containers. There's also categories for Windows Subsystem for Linux, remote, SSH ones, Codespaces. Here's this container, right? This is the one that's running. By the way, Visual Studio Code will handle the start and the shutdown of containers. So when we close this, it will automatically shut it down. So anyway, if we have one of these selected, what you can see here is in Devcontainers video, there's a bunch of information. There's some information in attributes, but what we want to look at is these mounts. And the mounts tell us this is how Docker persists information. It keeps information after the container will shut down. And so it'll be there when it comes back. So this workspaces directory that we're in here is being persisted at this volume. So what you can do is right click and hit inspect for this volume and you'll get some information and it will tell you the mount point. So this is the file path of where this data is being stored. So if you go there, you can actually see the files that you would in this directory, right? So if we show all the files, you would have a Devcontainers video folder, and inside that you would have all the files you'd expect to see here. So if you needed to access them outside of VS Code, you could use your file, well, whatever file manager you want. In this case, it's going to be on the Windows Subsystem for Linux side. If you're already on Linux or Mac OS, you can probably access this a little easier. Another way to look at that is to find the volume here. They are typically named with the repository, the owner and the repository. So same thing. I could click here and I could hit inspect and it should open up the same thing, file or the mount point. So another way to do this is if you're on Windows, Docker for desktop looks kind of like this. There will be this list of containers. They will all have randomly generated names. The one that's currently running, and this is handled by VS Code, will be here. So this is you can see it's VSC dev container something, whatever I named it. If I click on that, you'll get some more information. I can hit inspect, I believe, and you'll see a list of all sorts of stuff like the environment variables that are inside the container, right? And if we scroll all the way down, we can see mounts, and you can see that the workspaces directory is mounted from this file path. So another way to see where these files are being stored. And you can see that it's also persists some other information like your VS Code information. And you can also check out the stats, supposedly how much CPU, memory, and network this container is using. And when I close VS Code, this container will stop running. Okay, so it takes a minute, but it does stop. Gracious Pain is no longer running. So if you've done all this, if you are on a new machine, it's easy to spin up the same dev environment with all the same software versions that you had before. If you bring a new person onto your project, they're easily able to get up and running. All they have to do is make sure Docker's installed on their machine, and in this case, use VS Code. So whether they're on Windows, Mac, or Linux, they should be able to work with you pretty quickly. Another thing that's nice that we get out of using the Devcontainers is that I think it integrates very, very well with Codespaces, as we kind of learned earlier. So if you go to your repository and you click on Codespaces, right, we can create a Codespace. And I believe since we have this Devcontainer folder already there, it will automatically start using the image that we specified. So let's see what happens. Okay, so it did try to, it tried to open the interface in my local VS Code, but it did look like it created it. I come back to the web browser, I can open in my local one, I guess JetBrains Gateway or Jupyter Lab, but let's try opening it in the browser. So if we can edit our code in our customized development environment in our web browser, let's see what happens. All right, here we are in the web browser version. Let's see here, and let's see if FFmpeg is in here. Looks like it is. We have which Firestore CLI. Nope, Firebase, excuse me, that's in here. Okay, I think we will need to run npm install because this is on the new machine. Yeah, so if I try to run npm run dev, this will give me an error because we didn't install it yet, right? So this is not running on my system anymore. This is running on the remote server GitHub Codespaces. So let's go ahead and install dependencies. Okay, that installed pretty quick. And if we run npm run dev, let's see what happens. Looks like it is started on local server. So if we go here, we can click this link and this is going to connect to the forwarded port. So now it's going to go to a unique URL that's running the dev server. And if I come back here, I can maybe change the text from pink. Let's change it back to teal. Let's save that. Yeah, okay, we're already back to teal. There we go. A web-based Visual Studio Code, custom, portable, reproducible development environment, okay? This makes it really easy to onboard people and they can contribute to your application. They don't have to have Visual Studio Code. They just have to have a web browser. They don't have to have Docker. They can just go to Codespaces if you're willing to use the web server based implementation. But you got a lot of options. I think this is the easiest way to handle this kind of setup. I don't think it was too bad. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and like it. If you want to see more of these kind of things from me, clicking subscribe would be appreciated. And let me know what you think. If there's anything you would do differently, if you try it out, let me know how it goes or if I missed anything. I appreciate your time watching, and I will see you in the next one.